Hello, everybody. This is the Monday Night Pod, Tyler and Fensky. We're going to be continuing our study this week in Psalm 57, part 2 of it, focusing on the cave of Adullam.
Yeah, so if you were with us last week, we talked about this too shall pass from Psalm 57. Psalm 57 is when it says that David had fled from Saul into the cave. That's in 1 Samuel 22. So it says, verse 1, David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him.
Yeah, just for further context of where David is at this point, we already know that he's on the run from Saul. We just saw him at Gath, which was a territory of the Philistines. We've talked about that in months past. Just what the Lord did for him there. He's in enemy territory, and the song that was said about him ended up catching up to him, and it looked like it was going to cause him a lot of trouble. The one that said Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And to get out of that, David does whatever it takes. He literally just acts insane, right? And once he does that, he's able to get out of that situation. And from there, he flees to this cave of Adullam, right? And just for reference, Adullam literally means place of refuge, right? David comes to a place of refuge, and the first point tonight is God will always give you what you need when you need it. David's been on the run. He's been on his own. He literally just had to act like he was insane. You can imagine if you were in his shoes, you could just be spent right here, just exhausted. And Adullam is where the Lord allows David to fully just collect himself, to gather himself. And it's where the Lord really builds him up before he sets him forth and prepares him for what is to come next.
Yeah, you made the point tonight of, David had been an anointed king, and it's a path at this point that does not match what you would expect that to look like. Things have looked much different where he's had to run from Saul on his own, like you said, runs into a lot of trouble in Gath, where it was the point that his enemies in Israel, he thought he would be safer with the Philistines than even in Israel. And then it ends up ultimately in the cave of Adullam, where just his trajectory is looking so much different than what has been prophesied over him. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot to learn from the cave and what went on in this situation for him.
Yeah, it can be a frustrating thing to where you feel like the Lord's spoken a word over your life, or he's put a destiny in front of you or revealed something to you. It can be a tough thing to experience in the moment when your circumstances don't align with that at all, right? We think back to when Samuel anointed him. We come back all these years later, and he has yet to be appointed. And you think about the highs and lows that he's gone through, to where he kills Goliath. There's highs with that. He should have been set up for life with that. He goes on all these campaigns and has victories, so much success that literally becomes his status, right? That's literally what he's known as a successful warrior, right? And so he has all these things going from him, and then it's like, boom, Saul wants to kill him, and he's on the run. And so there's all these contradictions with what the Lord has spoken to him versus what his real life circumstances look like, and it's just a word to stick with it, right? It will come to pass. The Lord's working on it. It's not what it looks like, and so if you can just stay the course and let the Lord bring you to your Adullam, there's a lot that can happen for you from there once you're actually in the cave.
Yeah. And in times of distress, that's when you prove your faithfulness. When things are difficult for you, that's what it means to be faithful.
Yeah.
Can you stay this course? Can you stay consistent when things are difficult for you?
Yeah.
And that's what he's proving here in Adullam. You see here that the first thing is his brothers and his father's household heard about it. They went down to him there. And that'd be easy to kind of read over and go on to the next verse, but there is an important point with that.
Yeah, so the last time that, or at least in my recollection, the last time that we saw David's family, it was pretty negative for him. You talk about the last time that we experienced him with his father. We look back at 1 Samuel 16, and it's literally Samuel's told by the Lord, go to the house of Jesse, and I will show you the next ruler over Israel there. This is the point where the Lord had rejected Saul as king and told Samuel to go find the next king. And he had 8 sons total. 7 of his sons were there. David was not. And he goes through each and every single one of his sons. Some of them, Samuel was like, this has to be the guy. And the Lord was like, no, this isn't. The man looks at the outward appearance. I look at the heart, right? And so it comes in, and there's 7 of these sons, and Samuel has rejected through the Lord. And it's like, okay, do you have any others? And literally, David isn't even there.
Right.
That's what his father had thought about him. He thought so little of him that he wouldn't even have had him present to be acknowledged or recognized or considered, right? So that's where things were with his father. He literally thought he was so useless. That's how little he thought of him. He wasn't even there. And then if you look at 1 Samuel 17 with his brothers, it's like the reason the Lord chose David was because of his heart. He said, I want a man after my own heart. And we see when Goliath comes about and everyone's afraid of him. This is 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 28. It says, when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. We know David was going to be the one that ultimately killed Goliath. You can see how little they thought of David and how much animosity was there, how they viewed David in total, right? And so for them to come to the cave spoke volumes.
It's a big topic, right? And you mentioned that tonight. But people tend to judge you how they first met you. Their initial impression of you. That's why people have all sorts of problems with you when you progress or grow or change in life.
Yep.
And that applies to many things across the board. When it comes to just your family, I mean, you can look at Jesus' ministry. Mm-hmm. You can look at, obviously, Joseph, Moses, David, all getting a lot of just opposition from their own family. And, we've all been home for the holidays or seen the family on vacation, and they often still think you're 8 years old. So they don't understand that you've grown up and you maybe, you've gone beyond what you were before. Mm-hmm. They can't see that, you're still the baby boy, you're still the child, still view you as immature, whatever it may be. But he definitely had a lot of just kind of like static from his family. You made a good point there. I mean, Samuel, who is running Israel at that point, comes to this sacrifice, and it wasn't even considered that David would be present for this. His dad didn't even think that he would be a candidate. Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned too his older brother, just the static he get from his older brother, where the very gifting that he'd been given was what his older brother was, attacking him about. But in that 1 Samuel 16, it says he's anointed in the presence of his brothers. Mm-hmm. Right? So right there, after they've all been rejected, mm-hmm. now they see their youngest brother get anointed in front of them. Of course, that's going to build some animosity. I think the point to take out of this is that it's almost like a comparison thing, where sometimes you have to be exposed to people that really treat you bad in order to be forgiving and accepting and reconcile with people that maybe there was a problem, but it wasn't near what you experienced with somebody else. You had to be around the ones that tried to kill you.
Yeah.
They tried to take it all down, and now you can weigh the two. You can understand the two enough that you can, when people then are coming back that maybe you're like kind of down on or didn't think they were all that great. Now you'll be much more open to that because now you have a comparison point.
Yeah.
And I think that's what he went through with his family, because it was once Saul is on the, trying to kill him, and he's seeing this dynamic, men are waiting outside of his house to kill him, And that's an important point. He was leading Israel in their campaigns. So the very men that he had trained and gone to battle with are the same ones that are waiting outside of his house and now are part of Saul's chosen men that are trying to hunt him down.
Yeah.
You talk about betrayal. So, but now you can weigh that. Here's the people who are trying to kill me versus, here's my brother and family that were not as, it wasn't a perfect relationship, but I can now weigh the two.
Yeah, sometimes you need a greater opposition to put everything in perspective.
Right.
Right. And you can see, just what the Lord's will was in that. Here's the people that rejected him, and yet in this time of trial, they're the ones that go to him. Right. And he's able to make sure that they're provided for and they're safe. And, it kind of is just brought full circle. Right. And I think that's just like a developmental part in just being a leader in general and walking into your calling is like you have to put those small things aside. Right. Yeah. If you're going to let those small things still bother you. Right. Like good luck dealing with the Sauls. Good luck dealing with the people.
Real enemies. Yeah.
Real opposition.
Yeah. Why are we holding on to these small beefs or this wasn't perfect 2 years ago, or this made me upset a year ago, when here's some real enemies in front of you.
Absolutely.
And now you have some perspective on that, right?
Yeah, full maturation, in the cave, and that's an example of that, right? And then from there, verse 2, it says, all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gather around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him.
Yeah, so you see God wrapping 400 guys around his vision. I looked that up. It was so Apple very famously started in a garage. Steve Jobs, 21 years old, and was it Steve Wojciechowski?
Wozniak?
Wozniak. 26 years old in the garage. Amazon started in a garage. Walt Disney started in a garage. Despise not the day of small beginnings, right? As it says in Zechariah 4, and that's what you're seeing here, where this eventually would become, we know from 1 Samuel 24, or 2 Samuel 24, when ultimately they do the census, where it lists that in Israel there were 800,000 able-bodied men who could handle a sword, and in Judah 500,000. That's 1.3 million. So eventually this fighting force would become 1.3 million. Even a little bit more if you see the Chronicles account of that, because Joab didn't like that order to the point that he didn't count. I think it was Benjamin, didn't count Benjamin, one of the tribe. So, but 1.3 million, starting with 400. But this became David's core. Yeah, I think that is part of leadership, is you have to see people not as they are, but what they can become. Because it is important to note that in distress or in debt or discontented, they're not ever described like that ever again in Scripture, right? This became the foundation of this fighting force for him. These also were the same guys who wanted to stone him at Ziklag, so they were not perfect. But that's an important point too, because you can't just be like, oh, I'm only going to work with the best and the brightest and the most perfect, and where's the perfect ones for me? I mean, that was about a couple months ago. Guy in here who's always been very good, so he's high school MVP, and he was an early rounder and a major leaguer. And he made an offhand comment about a couple of younger guys in here, just how, basically they're just not very good at baseball, right? They're high school guys, and they're mediocre in high school right now. And that's certainly accurate. But if you're going to lead people, you have to see them for what they can become, not as they are. Yeah. What can they grow into, what they can progress? How can you help guide them there? That's really leadership and mentorship, is helping people reach what they're capable of. Yeah. To see their potential. So if you're going to receive the in distress or in debt or discontented, and why am I getting these people? Why can't I be getting better people, or whatever complaint you would have about it? It's not a demonstration of leadership. You see Joseph being given leadership over The guy's in prison,
Yeah.
leading over his peer. He's a prisoner. He's leading his fellow peer group of prisoners. That's real leadership. You know?
Yeah. Being able to see the seed and once it's watered, what it could fully come into, right? And I think another important point is understanding that David attracted who he was at that point, right? That was literally him in that moment. He was distressed, in debt. He was discontented, right? What does the Lord have next for me? You know, he said that in the following verses. I'm going to go there and see what the Lord has for me, right? Trying to find a vision. It was for those reasons that David was able to relate to those people and for them to also be able to relate to him, right? There was that symbiotic relationship of like real recognizing real, right? And you have to go through that to be able to get there, right? David wouldn't have been able to lead them if he still would have the mentality of I'm on these campaigns with these trained soldiers in Israel, right? He had to really go through it to be able to relate and get the most out of these people. It says he became their leader, right? They came to him, right? And that's I think that's real leadership 101 is the people will come to you, right? They will be drawn to you, right?
It's a good point. I think you can't effectively lead somebody if you haven't been there before. There has to be an understanding, like you've been in their shoes.
Yeah.
You know, I think like a simple example would be like if some guy walked in here and, you know, he wants to be really good at Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I could probably train him, but not nearly as effectively as somebody who had done that and lived that. I've never done Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
So how would I be able to help that guy? Because I've never been in his shoes.
Yeah.
So there's not an understanding of what he's going through and what, you know, all the above that goes into it. Yeah. You know, it would always be less effective than somebody who's walked that path before. You know, so you make a good point that David is drawing who he is, but also for that same reason, he's able to lead them and be effective because he's in the same position himself.
Yeah.
And that's what, you know, is making it very effective. You know, in distress, in debt, in discontented, you said, and he became their leader. I think that, you know, broad strokes here, but yeah, I think you're always going to have the most, you're going to be the most effective if you're working with people with, you know, they have the same problems that you've had. And you understand those problems because you've dealt with them yourself. You've been in their shoes.
Yeah.
You know, and it's almost like if you're being led on that and somebody hasn't gone through that problem, you almost like doubt that. Like, is this really who should be leading me? Because it's a lot different of just reading it or understanding from a knowledge position. That's important, but also having that just experiential knowledge, or you've been there. You know.
Yeah, and then that kind of draws to the point of why would God work it in this way, right? You can start to see why God would bring David through everything that he brought him through up to this point to set him up for this moment, to set him up for what would be to come, right? You ask a question, or I'm asking a question, why would God work it this way? In my opinion, it's so that God alone could get the glory, right? You take David, and it's like if he was just given the kingdom, right? Easily, you know, just smooth transfer of power. You know, this boss to this boss. You know, like if it were to happen like that, it's like, okay, like it's really hard to just say, oh, like, you know, I have the kingdom, but God wanted it so that David had the God of the kingdom. And he always kept his perspective, right? It's the Lord who worked this out for me. It's the Lord who's leading me. It's the Lord who trains my hands for war, right? The Lord above everything, right? I'm a man after God's own heart. And with that, the Lord knew that David could be entrusted with all these circumstances and be in distress and still prove himself faithful, right? You think Saul could have gone through that? No shot, right? And so it's like, why would the Lord let David come to this point out of Adullam? It's like, that's why, right? So that it's the Lord who gets the credit, and we can all concede, like, despise not the day of small beginnings. David goes into this cave alone without an army. He comes out with 400 guys that, you know, were just ostracized for more or less. And it's like from there, here's the mighty men that built the foundation of everything that happened to come.
I think it's important too to note, because if you skip down into a little later in the verses, so Saul is talking with all his officials standing around him. This would be verse 7. He says, "Listen, men of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse, David, give all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds?" And he says, is that why you have all conspired against me? But the point there is Saul is reinforcing just this carrot that he has of, he can give you title, he can give you money, property. David can't do that. Well, that in and of itself was almost the magic of what was going on in the cave of Adullam, was that it was being built around just a real like culture and community, not the stuff that could have come with it, right? So if you're going to go to David, that means you're leaving Saul. Mm-hmm. So you're leaving the titles, the fields, the property, the shiny stuff, to go to this cave to, be on the run with David. And certainly you see some, guys are getting pushed by some circumstances as well, but you're still leaving the opportunities with Saul for what seems like a more difficult opportunity, but of just what was real, just authentic going on there.
There's a cause.
Right.
Yeah. They left the stuff for the cause, right? And that's how the Lord worked it all together. So just in recap real quick, it's, you can have a word spoken over your life. The Lord can have a destiny for you. There's always going to be a process that comes with it. Right? There's going to be some ups to it. There's going to be some downs to it. A lot of times the Lord will bring you to your cave of Adullam, right? To where it's just you and him. And he's going to develop you. He's going to build you up. He's going to encourage you. You're going to find out who you are apart from everybody, apart from the Jonathans, apart from everyone. Just you and God. It's the moment where he builds you up and he prepares you. He brings that healing all the way through. And like David, he was given the foundation of what he was going to need to take his next step forward, right? So whenever you find yourself in that moment, realize, one, you're in distress. This is your opportunity to prove your faithfulness to the Lord. Two, be patient. Find out what you're supposed to be doing in the meantime. Writing psalms, building yourself up, finding community, building yourself up into the leader, letting the Lord build you up into the leader that you're supposed to be, letting those people come to you, figuring out what the cause is. And from there, you're able to see the Lord move everything forward and experience the actual blessing and reach the destination.
Yeah, it's a time of preparation.
Yeah.
Time of development.
Yep.
You made the point tonight, you referenced Kurt Warner. You don't know that name, so that was a guy who was briefly on the Packers practice squad, gets cut, he's now bagging groceries, and then he plays 3 years in a really obscure arena league, right? For that, what was it, Iowa Barnstormers?
Correct.
Off of that, gets picked up by an NFL team, string of injuries, gets thrust into this position, wins MVP, wins the Super Bowl MVP, becomes a Hall of Famer. The key point out of that is those 3 years that he spent in the Arena League playing for this tiny, obscure thing. That was exactly that style of football that was being played was exactly what he had to learn, quick trigger spread offense, because that was then what the NFL was pivoting to in the form of the Rams, where he ended up, the greatest show on turf, where now they're running this spread concept and obviously, running back as wide receiver and so on and so forth. And he was perfect for that. Because of the skills that he developed in obscurity those 3 years in the Arena League. So if he does not have those 3 years of obscurity in the Arena League, the best he could have possibly hoped for would have been just holding a clipboard in the NFL.
Yep.
And nobody would know his name.
Yeah.
Let alone have the success that he had in becoming a Hall of Famer, right? So it's like that. That's what the Cave of Adullam really represents, right? It's just that time of preparation, that time of development, like you said, where he's now by himself, and now here's the people that are starting to be put around for this vision to start to come to completion, but it's very small. It's like they're in the garage. It's Apple in the garage. It's Amazon in the garage. It's Disney in the garage. I thought that was one of the funniest things ever for some reason. Of course, I can't remember who it is, but when we were first starting out and somebody made some comment through somebody else, of course, just like running their mouth, and said something about how we were in like this tiny warehouse. It's like, where else would we be? Would it be better to just try to take out some massive loan for some huge facility that we can't fill and just be stressed out and under debt and go out of business in 3 years as soon as the loan's up, and then just be swimming in debt from there? Like, where else would it start? This is perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect spot that we started. Dinky little warehouse, tight, cramped, exactly how we wanted it from where we started in a garage. It was just a slightly bigger garage, but it's like, despise not the day of small beginnings. And how that applies to you, if you're listening personally, is that it's a marathon, not a sprint, in anything that you're going to be great in life. And it's much more about perseverance, as you will find out, than it is about initial talent. And the first will be last, and the last will be first. So that period of just where God puts you in isolation, where maybe nobody knows your name, nobody cares about you, you're not getting any accolades, where you're just developing, where you're just stacking bricks, where you're putting on a foundation, that's a blessing, because that can be your launch for much, much bigger things. That's the cave of Adullam.
Yeah, despise not the day of small beginnings. You never know what the Lord can use with the faith, even the size of a mustard seed. So that's part 2 of Psalm 57. This is the Monday Night Pod, Tyler and Fensky.